Margaret never hurried through grief, because she had learned long before that grief had its own pace, like the slow current of the Elkwater River that passed beyond Bramble Crossing, sometimes gentle enough to mirror the clouds, and sometimes swift enough to uproot entire trees without warning. As a little girl, she had watched her father, Elias Rowan, stand beside that river at dawn with rough hands folded behind his back, studying its surface before opening the trading post each morning, and he would tell her that every river carried two stories at once, the one everyone could see above the water and another hidden beneath it, where the strongest currents traveled unseen. Those words settled inside her long before she understood them, becoming part of the quiet foundation on which she built her life. We often imagine strength arriving with loud declarations or impossible victories, yet the truest strength usually begins in ordinary mornings, in chores completed without praise, in promises kept when nobody is watching, and Margaret's childhood was filled with those unnoticed victories. The Rowan Trading Post stood at the edge of Bramble Crossing, where wagon trails met the river landing, its broad porch weathered by decades of wind and rain, its cedar walls carrying the scent of coffee beans, tobacco leaves, flour sacks, lamp oil, leather harnesses, and freshly cut timber all at once. Travelers remembered it, not because it was the largest store along the route, but because every weary soul who entered found kindness before commerce. Elias believed that a hungry traveler deserved bread before bargaining, and that a widow with empty hands deserved credit without humiliation. Some neighboring merchants laughed at such generosity, insisting that compassion never balanced ledgers. Yet year after year, people returned to the Rowan Trading Post because trust proved more valuable than profit. Margaret absorbed every lesson without realizing she was learning. She could judge the weight of flour by lifting a sack with one arm, recognize the quality of leather from the sound it made when folded, and remember the names of families who visited only twice each year. More importantly, she learned to notice what others overlooked. She saw when an exhausted farmer pretended not to be hungry. She noticed when children stared too long at apples they knew their parents could not afford. She quietly slipped extra nails into a carpenter's order after a storm destroyed his barn. Elias never scolded her for such gestures. Instead, after the customers departed, he would simply nod and say that wealth measured only in coins vanished with time, while wealth measured in gratitude often returned decades later in forms no accountant could predict. Her mother, Ruth Rowan, possessed gentleness that steadied every room she entered. She stitched torn coats for strangers, brewed herbal remedies from plants gathered in the hills, and believed every broken thing deserved one honest attempt at repair before being discarded. Under Ruth's guidance, Margaret learned to restore cracked furniture, mend worn quilts, polish tarnished brass, and repair drawers that no longer closed. Wood remembers the hands that shaped it, Ruth often whispered, while smoothing fresh oil across old oak. Treat it kindly, and it will tell you where it hurts. Those simple lessons seemed little more than household wisdom then, yet years later they would become the key to everything hidden inside the abandoned trading post. Bramble Crossing itself lived between hope and hardship. Spring floods often carried away docks, summer droughts cracked fields. Winters buried roads beneath snowdrifts so deep that neighbors survived only by sharing supplies. Yet the town endured because its people understood dependence upon one another. Barn raisings became celebrations. Harvests belonged to entire families instead of individuals. Every Christmas lanterns glowed from every porch regardless of wealth, and no table remained empty while another overflowed. Margaret grew into adulthood believing community survived not because every citizen prospered, but because enough people refused to let others disappear unnoticed. When she reached 20 years of age, Elias entrusted her with keeping portions of the trading post accounts. Unlike many merchants, he never concealed his books from his daughter. He showed her every debt, every payment delayed for compassion's sake, every barrel purchased on faith that another season would bring better harvests. Numbers speak, he told her, while tracing columns of ink with his finger, but only if someone listens for the people hidden inside them. A line showing unpaid flour might represent a widow nursing 3 children. A missing payment for horse feed might belong to a rancher whose animals had died in an unexpected blizzard. Margaret learned that figures alone never revealed truth unless joined with understanding. Those evenings beside the lamplight shaped her mind into one capable of seeing beyond appearances, of asking not merely what something was worth, but whom it had once served. Years passed peacefully enough, until change arrived quietly, disguised as progress. A railway line stretching many miles east redirected commerce away from river routes. New mercantile companies established larger stores closer to the depot. Customers who once traveled by wagon began purchasing goods from catalog houses, promising lower prices and quicker deliveries. Bramble Crossing shrank little by little. The laughter on the trading post porch grew less frequent. Empty rocking chairs remained still through entire afternoons. Elias never complained. Instead, he continued extending credit to struggling families, believing the difficult years would eventually pass. But generosity becomes dangerous when prosperity fails to return. One failed harvest became two. Timber prices collapsed after a distant mill closed. Several ranchers moved west, abandoning unpaid accounts they had intended to settle. Margaret suggested tightening credit, reducing inventory, perhaps even selling portions of the property before debt became impossible. Yet Elias answered with the same steady kindness that had guided him his whole life. "If we close our hands now," he said softly, "then what did all these years of trust truly mean?" His words carried dignity, but the world beyond Bramble Crossing no longer rewarded such faith. New banks purchased old debts. Strangers replaced neighbors across polished desks. Contracts grew longer while mercy grew shorter. Margaret sensed the approaching storm before anyone else could see it, just as her father once read hidden currents beneath the river's surface. Yet even foresight cannot always prevent loss. She watched ledger balances tilt steadily toward disaster, each month stealing another piece of the future her parents had built with patient hands. And though none of them yet admitted it aloud, the beloved trading post had begun drifting toward the day when another name would appear upon its deed. The change did not arrive with a single catastrophe, but with 100 quiet disappointments that gathered like dust upon forgotten shelves. Ruth fell ill during one relentless winter, insisting until her final weeks that she merely needed more rest, though everyone could see her strength slipping away with each passing day. She continued sewing by the fire even when her hands trembled too much to guide the needle straight, smiling whenever Margaret offered to finish the work for her. "There will come a day," she whispered one evening, as snow tapped softly against the windows, "when you'll mend something far greater than cloth. Promise you won't throw broken things away too quickly." Margaret promised without understanding, believing her mother spoke only of furniture and family heirlooms. After Ruth's passing, the house grew unbearably quiet. Elias buried himself in work, arriving before sunrise and remaining long after darkness settled across the valley, as though keeping every lantern burning might somehow hold sorrow outside the walls. Yet grief has a way of finding every doorway. Within 2 years, Elias himself weakened, worn more by worry than age. The ledgers he once balanced with calm confidence began to weigh upon him like stones. He never complained about the debts owed to him, only those he owed others, for he believed a man's promise should outlive him. Before his final illness carried him away, he called Margaret beside his bed and placed into her hands the old brass key that had opened the trading post since before she was born. "Buildings matter less than people," he murmured, his voice scarcely louder than the wind moving through the curtains. "If someday the walls belong to someone else, remember that our true inheritance was never nailed into timber." Those became the last words she heard from him. After the funeral, Margaret stood alone behind the familiar counter where generations had traded fairly and spoken honestly, staring across shelves that once overflowed with supplies and now held more empty spaces than goods. She resolved to save the business, not from pride but from gratitude, believing that abandoning her parents' life's work without one final struggle would dishonor everything they had taught her. She worked harder than anyone believed possible. Before dawn, she unloaded wagons herself. She repaired broken fences around the property instead of hiring laborers. She accepted sewing, bookkeeping, furniture repairs, and accounting work during evenings, simply to keep interest payments current. Travelers admired her determination, yet admiration alone never satisfied bankers. The First Valley Mercantile Bank had recently appointed a new regional representative named Horace Bellamy, a polished man from the city whose boots remained spotless no matter how muddy the streets became. He spoke pleasantly enough in public, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy, but behind every smile rested calculations untouched by memory or compassion. He had never known Elias Rowan. To him, the trading post represented only depreciating property secured against unpaid loans. During his first inspection, he walked through every room with a notebook, measuring windows, testing floorboards, estimating resale value, while Margaret answered questions that felt less like conversation than inventory. "Sentiment," he remarked while closing his ledger, "has unfortunate habits of interfering with practical decisions." Margaret replied quietly that communities were seldom built through practical decisions alone. Bellamy merely smiled, thanked her for her time, and departed. 3 months later, the formal notice arrived. The remaining balance had become impossible under revised lending terms established by the bank's new ownership. Unless the debt was satisfied within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Margaret carried the letter into the empty trading post after sunset and read it again beside the counter her father had built with his own hands. Every sentence sounded colder than the last, each carefully written line reducing decades of honest labor into legal obligations and numbered clauses. Neighbors offered sympathy but little else. Most struggled beneath their own burdens. Some quietly suggested accepting defeat before additional costs accumulated. Others advised leaving Bramble Crossing entirely for one of the growing railroad towns where employment could be found. Margaret listened respectfully, yet remained unwilling to surrender, while any possibility remained. She sold nearly everything not essential for survival. Her mother's silver serving spoons disappeared first, then spare furniture, livestock, decorative rugs, framed paintings, and finally the family piano whose worn keys had once filled winter evenings with hymns. Each sale brought temporary relief, but never enough. Interest continued growing faster than hope. On the final morning before repossession, Margaret unlocked the trading post one last time. She swept the porch, though no customers would come. She polished the brass scales until they reflected the morning sun. She straightened shelves already destined to stand empty beneath another owner's care. At noon, Bellamy arrived with 2 clerks carrying official papers. They treated her politely, almost gently. Yet kindness could not soften the meaning of what occurred. One signature transferred generations of sacrifice into institutional possession. Bellamy accepted the old brass key from her gloved hand, glanced briefly around the quiet building, and remarked that the property would likely be auctioned quickly because few structures of its size remained available along the river. Margaret thanked him for his consideration, though the words tasted bitter upon her tongue. She walked away carrying only one carpet bag containing several dresses, family photographs, a Bible, her father's pocket watch, and $23 that remained after settling every obligation she possibly could. People later remembered seeing her pause only once at the bend overlooking the trading post. She did not wave or weep. She simply looked toward the porch, where countless strangers had once become friends, and then continued walking without turning back again. For weeks, she survived by accepting temporary work wherever it appeared. She cooked in logging camps, mended clothing for ranch families, copied legal documents for the courthouse, and slept in spare rooms offered by generous widows who remembered the kindness Elias and Ruth had once shown them. Pride would have tempted many toward bitterness, but Margaret carried herself with quiet dignity because her parents had taught that hardship revealed character more clearly than prosperity ever could. Even so, loneliness settled heavily upon her. Each evening she wondered whether the values she cherished still belonged in a changing world, where contracts outweighed handshakes and profit replaced neighborly trust. Then, one windy afternoon near the beginning of autumn, news spread through Bramble Crossing that the bank intended to auction several repossessed properties before winter, including the abandoned Rowan trading post. Most townspeople assumed an investor from the railway would purchase it, tear it down, and replace it with a warehouse. Margaret attended the auction only because she wished to say goodbye in silence. She stood at the edge of the gathering with her worn carpetbag resting beside her boots, expecting nothing except another farewell. Yet, as the bidding progressed, buyers ignored the neglected trading post. Years of neglect since the repossession had left broken shutters hanging crookedly, portions of the roof sagging, windows cracked, and weeds swallowing the porch steps. Investors considered repairs too expensive. Bellamy himself appeared increasingly impatient as each unsuccessful bid passed. Finally, the auctioneer lowered the opening price again until the building cost scarcely more than a pair of healthy workhorses. A strange stillness settled over the crowd. Margaret looked into her purse, counted every remaining dollar she possessed, and before fear could silence courage, she lifted her hand. The auctioneer hesitated before acknowledging her bid because nearly everyone present knew how little she possessed. Murmurs drifted through the gathering as neighbors exchanged uncertain glances, wondering whether they had heard correctly. Horace Bellamy studied her with visible surprise, then quietly confirmed with the clerk that her payment could indeed be accepted if no higher offer appeared. The silence stretched long enough for wind to rattle the loose shutters of the abandoned building. One by one, the prospective buyers lowered their eyes. None wished to spend more restoring a neglected trading post than the land itself appeared worth. The auctioneer lifted his hammer, called for additional bids twice, and when no answer came, the sharp crack of wood against wood echoed across the square. In that single sound, the building returned to the daughter who had once lost it, though scarcely anyone believed she had gained anything worth celebrating. Some pitied her, others quietly shook their heads, convinced desperation had clouded her judgment. Bellamy himself approached after the paperwork was signed and offered what sounded almost like sincere advice. "Miss Rowan," he said carefully, "there are times when letting go proves wiser than beginning again. This property has been stripped of anything valuable. Even the previous inventory was liquidated months ago. I fear you've purchased little more than repairs." Margaret thanked him with the same calm dignity she had shown on the day he accepted her father's key. "Perhaps," she replied, "but old places sometimes remember things newer eyes overlook." Bellamy gave a courteous nod, clearly unconvinced, and departed. As the last wagon rolled away and the crowd dispersed, Margaret stood alone before the weathered porch. Paint curled from the siding in long, brittle strips. One shutter swung back and forth with every gust, striking the wall in slow, uneven rhythm. Tall weeds reached almost to the steps, and ivy had begun climbing across the eastern corner of the building. The sign bearing the faded words "Rowan Trading Post" leaned crookedly from one remaining chain. She climbed the porch carefully, each board groaning beneath her boots like an old friend awakening after a long sleep. The familiar smell met her before she even opened the door. Dust lay thick across every surface, yet beneath it lingered cedar wood, lamp oil, leather, and faint traces of coffee beans long since removed. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing echoes that existed only in memory: her father's welcoming laughter, her mother's gentle footsteps, children running between barrels, travelers thanking them before continuing westward. When she opened her eyes again, the silence returned, deeper than before. There was no furniture, except a cracked counter left behind, because no buyer considered it worth hauling away. Shelves leaned unevenly against the walls. Sunlight entered through broken panes, casting bright columns where countless particles of dust drifted like tiny spirits suspended in time. Margaret set her carpetbag beside the old counter and slowly walked through every room. She inspected warped floorboards, tested window frames, examined the leaking roof, and counted each repair that winter would demand. The work seemed overwhelming, yet she never flinched. She had rebuilt furniture in worse condition than this. Buildings, like people, often looked beyond saving until someone cared enough to begin. She spent the remainder of that afternoon sweeping years of neglect from the floors. Broken glass disappeared into buckets. Rotten boards were stacked outside. Cobwebs vanished from corners that had not seen human hands in months. As twilight settled over Bramble Crossing, she lit a single oil lamp, placing it atop the counter where her father once greeted every customer. Its warm glow transformed the empty room. Shadows retreated just enough for hope to find a place among them. Over the following days, Margaret worked from sunrise until darkness concealed her tools. Neighbors occasionally wandered past, some bringing leftover lumber or a loaf of bread, though most admitted privately they doubted the effort would succeed. She accepted every kindness without asking for more. While scraping away layers of old paint from the counter one rainy afternoon, she noticed something curious. The wood along the back panel sounded different beneath the handle of her scraper. Most of the counter answered with a deep, solid knock, but one narrow section returned a slightly hollow echo. At first, she assumed moisture had damaged the interior, yet the sound lingered in her thoughts long after she resumed working. Her mother's voice drifted unexpectedly through memory. Wood remembers the hands that shaped it. Treat it kindly, and it will tell you where it hurts. Margaret set aside the scraper and ran her fingertips slowly across the grain. Years of dust concealed tiny details, invisible at first glance. Near the lower edge, she discovered an almost imperceptible seam hidden beneath layers of varnish and grime. It followed the pattern of the surrounding wood so perfectly that no casual observer would have noticed it. Curious now, she cleaned the area with linseed oil and a soft cloth until the grain emerged clearly. There, tucked beneath one decorative molding, rested the worn outline of a thumb-sized brass catch, darkened almost black with age. It had been intentionally disguised, not accidentally hidden. Her heartbeat quickened. She pressed gently. Nothing happened. She tried again with greater patience, remembering how old mechanisms often responded more readily to care than force. The catch shifted the slightest fraction, followed by a faint metallic click somewhere deep within the counter. A narrow section of wood eased outward no more than half an inch. Margaret stared in astonishment. She carefully gripped the edge and drew the concealed compartment open. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, lined with cedar so dry it still carried a faint fragrance despite the passing decades. Yet, it was not empty. Inside rested a neatly wrapped bundle tied with faded blue ribbon, protected beneath waxed cloth that had preserved it from moisture and decay. Her hands trembled as she lifted it into the lamplight. Beneath the bundle lay an old iron key unlike any she had seen in the trading post before, together with a small leather notebook whose cover bore no title. She untied the ribbon carefully. Instead of money or jewelry, she found several folded letters written in elegant handwriting, a packet of carefully drawn survey maps, and one sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the one who finds this only after the trading post has fallen silent." Margaret remained motionless for several long moments. The room around her seemed to disappear, until only the quiet flame of the lamp and the mysterious documents remained. Whoever had hidden them expected the trading post someday to stand abandoned. Whoever wrote that message believed another person would eventually discover it. And judging by the careful preservation, the contents had never been meant for ordinary business. She reached for the sealed envelope, noticing the wax bore an unfamiliar crest, a soaring heron above a winding river, encircled by the words, "For the keeping of what belongs to all." Before breaking the seal, she glanced once more around the empty room. Outside, rain whispered against the roof, while distant thunder rolled across the hills. Inside the forgotten trading post, surrounded by silence and memories, Margaret realized she had not purchased a ruined building after all. She had inherited the beginning of a mystery someone had waited many years for the right person to uncover. Margaret turned the envelope over several times before opening it, tracing the unfamiliar crest with the tip of her finger, as though memory itself might awaken beneath the worn wax. She had spent enough evenings beside her father studying ledgers to recognize careful handwriting when she saw it, and every graceful curve of ink upon the envelope suggested a person who believed words deserved patience. She broke the brittle seal with extraordinary care, unfolding the thick cream-colored paper inside until the lamp revealed lines written in rich brown ink. that time had softened but never erased. "If these pages have found you," the letter began, "then the trading post has reached the hour I always feared and secretly expected. Do not mourn the building before you understand why it was preserved. What rests hidden here belongs neither to merchants nor to banks, nor even to the family entrusted with its keeping. It belongs to every honest soul who ever built a life along the Elkwater River. If greed discovers these papers first, they will bury them again. If kindness discovers them, they will know what must be done." Margaret lowered the page, feeling an unexpected chill despite the warmth of the lamp. No signature appeared beneath the opening paragraph. Instead, the writer continued with calm certainty, as though speaking across decades directly into the room where she now stood. The letter explained that nearly 40 years earlier, before Bramble Crossing had become a permanent settlement, the valley's first traders, ranchers, river pilots, school teacher, physician, and blacksmith had quietly established what they called the common trust. Harvests failed often during those early years. Floods swept away homes without warning. Illness could leave entire families destitute before neighbors even realized help was needed. Rather than depending upon distant governments or wealthy investors, 12 founding citizens agreed to contribute a portion of every profitable season into a shared reserve intended only for the survival of future generations. Money alone, however, could easily be stolen or squandered. Instead, they invested in river access, timber rights, grazing parcels, and small pieces of land surrounding the valley, placing ownership through an intricate legal arrangement that no single individual could control. Every agreement was documented, witnessed, and concealed because outside speculators had already begun purchasing frontier property through deception and intimidation. The trust's location remained known only to successive keepers sworn never to use it for personal gain. Margaret's heartbeat quickened as she continued reading. The anonymous writer revealed that the Rowan family had never owned the trading post in the ordinary sense. Elias's grandfather, Thomas Rowan, had accepted the responsibility of safeguarding the trust because travelers naturally passed through the building, making it the safest place to conceal records no thief would suspect. Each generation quietly passed the knowledge forward only when the next proved guided more by integrity than ambition. Then tragedy interrupted the tradition. Thomas Rowan died unexpectedly, while his son served months away transporting supplies through mountain territory. Before anyone realized the secret had gone untold, fever claimed another member of the family, confusion scattered old papers, and the existence of the common trust slowly disappeared into forgotten memory. The hidden drawer remained sealed because no one remembered it existed. The final lines struck Margaret with astonishing force. If you are reading this, then fate has returned the trading post to hands capable of choosing between possession and stewardship. The maps will lead you to records proving what was set aside for the people of this valley. The notebook contains the names of every original trustee and every parcel acquired. Do not seek treasure beneath the earth. Seek justice beneath forgotten paper. Wealth hidden in coin disappears. Wealth hidden in rightful ownership can restore generations. Margaret read the letter twice more before reaching for the small leather notebook. Its pages contained neat entries dating back decades. Each parcel of land was listed with remarkable precision, accompanied by dates, witness signatures, and coded symbols matching those drawn upon the folded survey maps. Some entries described riverbanks preserved to prevent monopolies over ferry crossings. Others referred to timber groves purchased before lumber companies could seize them. There were orchards, grazing meadows, freshwater springs, warehouses, and even rights connected to the old river landing that everyone believed had long ago fallen into private ownership. Yet the notebook hinted that these properties had never legally passed into private hands because the original trust agreements contained conditions that no later transaction had satisfied. Margaret spread the maps across the counter. One yellowed sheet bore careful markings extending far beyond Bramble Crossing. Another displayed property boundaries she recognized immediately from years spent helping her father deliver supplies. Certain symbols matched locations still standing throughout the valley. Others referred to places abandoned long ago beneath overgrown fields. She noticed faint pencil notes added by different hands across many years, suggesting each successive keeper had updated the records whenever boundaries changed or neighboring farms expanded. The mystery reached far beyond forgotten receipts. It reached into the very foundation upon which Bramble Crossing had been built. Yet one question troubled her above all others. Why had no one claimed these properties already? She searched the notebook until a later entry answered her concern. During a period of regional conflict over land claims, several powerful businessmen attempted to seize portions of the valley through fraudulent deeds. To protect the common trust until lawful courts could resolve ownership, the trustees deliberately concealed the original documentation. They intended to recover it within months. Instead, accidents, illness, and unexpected deaths scattered those responsible before the hiding place could be revealed. Decades passed. Memories faded. Banks, investors, and corporations gradually assumed ownership over lands whose earliest records had simply vanished. Margaret leaned back against the counter, overwhelmed by the scale of what rested before her. If these documents proved authentic, they represented far more than family history. They challenged property claims, worth fortunes. They could expose generations of mistaken ownership, perhaps even deliberate fraud. She understood immediately why the writer had warned against greed. In the wrong hands, such knowledge could ignite endless legal battles, enriching only ambitious men while exhausting ordinary families. She carefully examined the iron key lying beside the notebook. Unlike house keys, its shaft ended in 3 unusual teeth, shaped almost like tiny steps. One map carried a small drawing of the identical key beside a location marked only with the words, River Archive. Margaret searched every page again until she discovered a brief note written in different handwriting. Records duplicated. Originals secured below the East Warehouse Foundation. Key retained within the keeper's drawer. She frowned thoughtfully. The East Warehouse no longer existed. Floodwaters had destroyed it years before she was born. Its foundations, however, still lay buried near the abandoned river landing beyond town. The realization settled over her slowly. The documents inside the drawer were never intended as complete proof. They were directions leading toward something larger, something preserved elsewhere in case these papers were ever discovered or destroyed. Outside, the rain finally ceased. Moonlight slipped through the cracked windows, silvering the old floorboards. Margaret gathered every document carefully, wrapping them once again in the waxed cloth, before placing them inside her carpet bag. She extinguished the lamp and stepped onto the porch, where cool autumn air carried the scent of wet earth and cedar. Across the sleeping town, lanterns glimmered faintly in distant windows, each tiny light belonging to families who had no idea that forgotten promises from another generation had quietly returned to the valley. As she looked toward the river, she remembered her father's words spoken so many years before beside the morning current. Every river carries 2 stories at once. The visible one everyone believes they know, and another moving silently beneath it, shaping everything above. Standing before the weathered trading post that everyone else considered worthless, Margaret understood at last that she had begun following the hidden current. Whatever waited beneath the ruined East Warehouse would determine whether the mysterious letter spoke truth or merely offered comforting legend, and before dawn broke over Bramble Crossing, she had already decided she would follow every clue until the river surrendered the story it had concealed for nearly half a century. Margaret scarcely slept that night. The mysterious letter rested beneath her pillow while the notebook and maps remained wrapped carefully inside her carpet bag. Yet even with every document close at hand, she feared waking to discover the entire discovery had been nothing more than a dream born from exhaustion and longing. Before the eastern sky had fully surrendered its stars, she lit a small lantern, tucked the iron key safely into her pocket, and began the familiar walk toward the abandoned river landing. Mist drifted across the Elkwater in pale ribbons, softening every tree and fence into ghostly silhouettes. The silence carried only the slow rhythm of water touching the shore and the distant cry of waking birds. She remembered accompanying her father there as a child when flatboats still arrived carrying barrels of molasses, crates of tools, and hopeful families searching for land farther west. The old East warehouse had stood proudly then, its broad doors thrown open from dawn until evening, while workers loaded wagons bound for every farm in the valley. A flood nearly 25 years earlier had swept the building away, leaving behind only fragments of its stone foundation, half buried beneath reeds and river grass. Most people considered the place nothing more than a forgotten ruin, avoided by fishermen and wandering livestock. Margaret followed the faded map carefully until she reached a cluster of weathered cottonwoods leaning over the water. The drawing indicated that the warehouse foundation extended farther beneath the earth than anyone realized, because later floods had buried much of it beneath layers of silt. She brushed away tangled weeds until the squared outline of old stones slowly emerged. Kneeling beside them, she compared each corner with the measurements recorded in the notebook. Everything aligned with remarkable precision. The key symbol had been sketched near what once served as the eastern support pillar. Margaret removed loose earth with a small hand shovel she had borrowed from the trading post, careful not to disturb more ground than necessary. After nearly an hour, her shovel struck something harder than stone. Clearing away the remaining soil revealed a flat iron plate scarcely larger than a dinner platter, its edges concealed so perfectly that decades of mud had rendered it invisible. At its center rested a rusted lock bearing the same soaring heron crest stamped upon the wax seal of the letter. Her pulse quickened. She withdrew the iron key from her pocket, wiped dirt from its teeth, and slid it gently into the lock. At first, nothing happened. Years of corrosion resisted every careful movement. She dripped a few drops of lamp oil into the mechanism and waited patiently, remembering her mother's insistence that stubborn things often yielded better to patience than force. Slowly the key turned. A deep metallic groan echoed beneath the earth as the lock released. Margaret lifted the iron ring set into the plate. Hidden hinges creaked after decades of silence, revealing a narrow stone shaft descending several feet below the old foundation. Cool air, smelling faintly of cedar and dry earth, drifted upward. She lowered the lantern cautiously into the opening before climbing down rough stone steps cut into one side. The underground chamber proved astonishingly dry. Thick limestone walls had protected it from floodwaters all those years. Along one side stood shelves built from heavy oak, their surfaces covered with carefully stacked wooden boxes sealed in wax. In the center rested a broad cedar chest, reinforced with iron bands. The room resembled not a treasure vault, but an archive created by people who expected future generations to value records more than riches. Margaret approached the cedar chest first. The same key opened its lock with surprising ease. Inside, she found dozens of rolled surveys, leather-bound ledgers, notarized agreements, hand-drawn plats, tax records, river charters, correspondence between the valley's founders, and thick packets bearing official territorial seals. Every document had been wrapped in oilcloth and separated by cedar dividers to preserve them from moisture. The organization spoke of extraordinary care. Whoever created this chamber intended these records to survive centuries if necessary. One ledger immediately captured her attention because its title had been burned neatly into the leather cover, the Common Trust Register. Opening its first page revealed the signatures of the original 12 trustees, including Thomas Rowan. Beneath each name appeared detailed descriptions of property donated for the future welfare of Bramble Crossing. As Margaret turned page after page, the scope of their vision unfolded before her. They had acquired riverfront acreage to ensure no ferry operator could charge desperate travelers unreasonable fees. They had reserved timberlands whose profits would one day fund a school and physician should the town require them. They had quietly purchased mineral rights beneath hills no one then considered valuable, believing unforeseen resources might someday sustain future generations. Most astonishing of all, they had written legal protections declaring that none of the trust's holdings could ever become personal inheritance. Every acre belonged permanently to the community itself, through carefully constructed agreements recognized under territorial law. Margaret understood then why the trust had vanished from memory. It had never been designed to enrich families. It had been created to prevent wealth from concentrating in the hands of a few. Such an idea would have threatened every ambitious speculator who later entered the valley. As morning sunlight gradually filtered through the open hatch above, she continued examining documents until one bundle tied with crimson ribbon stopped her cold. Across its cover, someone had written in bold script, concerning the Valley Consolidation Company. She untied the ribbon and discovered correspondence exchanged nearly 30 years earlier between the original trustees and a powerful investment syndicate attempting to acquire every major crossing along the Elkwater River. Several letters accused company representatives of forging deeds, intimidating settlers, and manipulating survey boundaries to seize public access routes. Attached to the correspondence were sworn witness statements and copies of authentic surveys proving the fraudulent claims. Margaret recognized one company name immediately because, although the corporation itself had long since disappeared, its remaining assets had eventually merged into institutions that evolved over decades. Among them stood the predecessor of the First Valley Mercantile Bank. She read the final memorandum twice before fully grasping its significance. The trustees had intended to present these records in court, but before proceedings began, a courthouse fire destroyed many public files, while illness swept through the valley. With witnesses dying and original deeds presumed lost, the legal challenge quietly collapsed. Over time, later owners assumed the disputed properties had been lawfully transferred, yet the authentic evidence had never been destroyed. It had been sleeping beneath the warehouse foundation all along. Margaret closed the ledger slowly, feeling the enormous responsibility settling upon her shoulders. This discovery possessed the power not merely to embarrass the bank, but to unravel decades of mistaken ownership, extending across much of the valley. She could already imagine men rushing to exploit the confusion for fortunes of their own. She also remembered the warning written in the first letter: seek justice beneath forgotten paper. Not profit, justice. She repacked every document exactly as she had found it, except for several certified copies and the common trust register, which she believed essential for understanding the archive. Before climbing back into daylight, she noticed one final item resting alone in the bottom of the cedar chest. It was a small wooden plaque no larger than a family Bible, polished smooth despite its age. Carved across its surface were words that seemed almost like a prayer. What we preserve together will outlive what we possess alone. Margaret carried the plaque with her as she emerged into the crisp morning air. The valley before her appeared unchanged, yet she knew every familiar hill now concealed a forgotten inheritance waiting to be restored. Unknown to her, however, she was no longer the only person beginning to suspect that the abandoned trading post contained something far more valuable than faded receipts. The tracks of another horse already marked the damp earth leading toward the warehouse ruins, fresh enough that they could only have been made earlier that same morning. And somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a pair of unseen eyes had quietly watched her disappear beneath the forgotten foundation. Margaret looked once more toward the quiet waters of the Elkwater, understanding that the greatest fortunes were never measured by gold hidden beneath the earth, but by the courage to preserve truth when it would have been easier to remain silent. The forgotten trading post had not simply returned to her hands, it had chosen its keeper once again, just as those who built Bramble Crossing had hoped generations before. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the unseen rider quietly turned his horse and disappeared into the morning mist, carrying news that someone had uncovered what powerful interests believed was lost forever. Margaret did not yet know who watched her, nor how fiercely they would fight to bury the truth again. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would honor the trust placed in her family, protect the forgotten legacy hidden beneath the valley, and restore what had always belonged to the people, no matter the cost. And as the first rays of sunlight broke across the river, illuminating the weathered walls of the old trading post with a golden glow they had not worn in decades, it seemed as though the building itself had awakened from a long and patient sleep, ready at last to tell the story it had guarded through generations of silence. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If Margaret's story reminded you that the greatest treasures are often hidden inside the things the world has already given up on, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time when you discovered unexpected value where everyone else saw only loss. And if stories of quiet courage, forgotten history, and extraordinary hope speak to your heart, Be sure to subscribe to Berry Tales, turn on the notification bell, and join us for another unforgettable journey into the hidden corners of the frontier. Until next time, stay close, stay kind, and remember that sometimes the smallest forgotten drawer can hold the future of an entire community.